The second round of the 1957 season rolled into Monaco, and with it came the usual ingredients. Impossibly narrow streets, impossibly expensive yachts, and a qualifying session with more drama than an Italian opera. Here, between the cliffs and the sea, speed is a dangerous luxury. The circuit winds through the heart of the city, much as it still does in 2025, skimming past the sunlit harbour, the towering hotels, and the unforgiving barriers that punish even the smallest mistake. But this is 1957, the year when the world decided life just wasn't moving fast enough. Elvis Presley was shaking up the music charts. The Boeing 707 took to the skies, shrinking oceans and continents, and the Soviets had just launched Sputnik, sending a little metal ball beeping over the heads of an astonished world. It was an era of optimism, ambition, and just a hint of madness. And in Formula One? The answer is complicated. On one hand, we are here, in Monaco, the playground of the rich, the brave, and the fearless. But on the other hand, in Italy, two different accidents cast a shadow over the sport. At the Modena circuit, where both Maserati and Ferrari test their latest machines, tragedy struck. Eugenio Castellotti, one of Italy's brightest talents, had been personally ordered by Enzo Ferrari to beat an unofficial lap record set by Jean Bera for Maserati. Castellotti obeyed, pushing harder and harder, lap after lap. But something went wrong. He ran off the track, struck a high curb at the chicane, and was thrown from the car with terrifying violence. At just 26 years old, Italy lost one of its most promising stars, and Ferrari, one of its fiercest competitors. And as if the season hadn't suffered enough heartache, just a week before the Monaco Grand Prix, another tragedy shook the world of motorsport. The 1957 Mille Miglia, the legendary open-road endurance race, once again turned Italy into a roaring labyrinth of danger. 1,000 miles of madness, thundering through cities, villages, and the countryside, on roads never meant for such speeds. Alfonso de Portago, Ferrari's stylish, charismatic star, had always been uneasy about this race. How could anyone, even with a navigator, truly know every twist, every hidden bump, over such an unforgiving stretch of public roads? Traveling at nearly 240 kilometers an hour, a tire on Portago's Ferrari 335S failed catastrophically. The car spun out of control, crashing violently into the crowd. De Portago, his co-driver Edmund Nelson, and 9 spectators, including 5 children, lost their lives in an instant. He was just 28 years old, a life lived at full throttle, a spirit as wild and vivid as the decade itself. Each death a brutal reminder. This sport demands everything, and it never promises to give anything back. Yet even as grief hangs heavy in the paddock, the world does not stop. Engines are fired, helmets are fastened, and here, on the twisting streets of Monte Carlo, the men of Formula One return once more to face the inevitable. When Ferrari arrived at the 1957 Monaco Grand Prix, it marked the debut of the Ferrari 801, the Scuderia's latest weapon in the World Championship. It was intended as a successor to the aging, though once formidable, Ferrari Lancia D50, a car originally designed by Vittorio Jano for Lancia, and inherited by Enzo Ferrari after Lancia withdrew from Formula One following Ascari's death and the company's financial collapse in 1955. The D50, known for its wide, side-mounted pannier fuel tanks and its powerful 2.5-litre V8 engine, had already shown its age by 1956. While still capable in the hands of 1956 champions like Juan Manuel Fangio, its complex construction and awkward weight distribution began to show limits on tighter circuits and against the growing threat of Van Wall and Maserati. Ferrari knew evolution was necessary. The Ferrari 801 was born as a heavily revised version of the D50, rather than a clean-sheet design. The project remained in the hands of Vittorio Jano, who stayed with Ferrari after the Lancia takeover. While the 801 retained some basic structural lineage from the D50, Nearly everything about it was re-examined and refined. The 801 used a steel tubular space frame chassis, a carryover in concept from the D50, but lightened and stiffened to handle better under braking and cornering loads. The pannier fuel tanks, once an experimental aerodynamic feature in the D50, were removed, and the car returned to a more conventional central tank layout. This dramatically improved the car's balance and reduced lateral weight shifts. Aerodynamically, the 801 was more compact, with cleaner lines and better weight distribution. Ferrari engineers narrowed the bodywork, streamlined the nose cone, and redesigned the cowling to sit lower, improving visibility and airflow. It remained front-engined, but in a tighter, more purposeful form. At the heart of the Ferrari was the Ferrari Tipo 130 engine, a 2.5-litre naturally aspirated V8, inherited in basic layout from the Lancia D50. However, significant modifications had been made. The cylinder heads were reworked, combustion chambers optimized, and twin overhead camshafts per bank ensured high revving capability. The engine produced approximately 275 to 280 horsepower at around 8,000 RPM, competitive for the time, but slightly behind Maserati's 250F in terms of power-to-weight ratio. Drum brakes were still the norm in 1957, and the 801 used large, finned aluminum drums on all four corners. They provided respectable stopping power, but were vulnerable to fade over longer distances, especially on high-speed circuits. At Monaco, however, with its low average speeds and frequent braking zones, the 801's setup was well suited. The new Ferrari 801 would continue to serve Ferrari throughout the 1957 season. It was a transitional machine, not yet a revolution, but a necessary evolution. Considering the recent tragedies that had cast a shadow over the world of racing, Scuderia Ferrari arrived in Monaco with a shaken and reduced squad. The proud team from Maranello now counted only Peter Collins, Mike Hawthorne, and Wolfgang von Trips among their active drivers, a sharp contrast to the strength and depth Ferrari usually commanded. Realizing that reinforcements were urgently needed, Enzo Ferrari himself turned to a trusted ally. Maurice Trintignant was summoned back into Ferrari's ranks. It wasn't a gamble. Trintignant had already carried Ferrari to glory here, on these very streets, claiming victory in Monaco 2 years earlier in 1955. Maserati arrived in Monaco with a strong, if slightly altered, lineup. Leading the charge was the ever-formidable Juan Manuel Fangio, supported by Carlos Menditagai, Harry Schell, Hans Hermann, and Giorgio Scarlatti. However, the team was missing one of its key pillars, Jean Bera. The fiery Frenchman was still recovering from injuries sustained during the Mille Mila, and his absence left a noticeable gap in Maserati's armor. In terms of machinery, Maserati came prepared. Alongside their proven fleet of lightweight 250F cars, the team introduced something new and daring, an experimental entry featuring a brand new 12-cylinder V-engine. Van Wall too came to Monaco with renewed ambition. The British team brought 3 freshly modified cars, noticeably different from last year's models, most strikingly with a wider, reworked nose, designed to improve airflow and cooling on the twisting streets of Monte Carlo. And behind the wheel of these new machines were 2 major new signings: Sterling Moss, lured away from Maserati, and Tony Brooks, brought over from BRM. It was a bold statement from Tony Vandervelde, not just upgrading the cars, but assembling a driver roster capable of challenging the continental giants on their own soil. Connaught also entered the 1957 season with a completely new driver lineup. Gone were the veterans. In their place, 2 rising stars from the fiercely competitive British Formula 3 scene: Stuart Lewis-Evans, a young driver with sharp instincts and a natural flair for tight circuits, and Ivor Bueb, known for his fearless approach and mechanical sympathy. However, one of the cars stood out sharply from the rest, fitted with a radically redesigned body known as the B-Dart. Gone was the classic clean shape of the earlier Connaughts. In its place was a distinctive aerodynamic humpback profile, with a long tapered tail and a rounded bulbous engine cover, intended to reduce drag and improve airflow over the car. The B-Dart was lighter, sleeker, and theoretically faster, though whether such innovations would pay off on Monaco's cramped, unforgiving streets was an open question. In addition, the 1957 Monaco Grand Prix marked the return of the Cooper team to the World Championship scene. Armed with their new rear-engine Formula 2 machines, the revolutionary T43 model, Cooper aimed to challenge the established order with fresh thinking and daring engineering. The T43, powered by a lightweight Coventry Climax 1.5-litre engine, turned traditional Grand Prix design on its head by positioning the engine behind the driver. This configuration offered several advantages: better weight distribution, improved traction, and greater agility, crucial traits on the tight, twisting streets of Monte Carlo. Although originally built for Formula 2 regulations, the nimble T43s proved quick enough to be competitive against the heavier and more powerful Formula 1 machinery, at least on certain circuits. At the wheel were two determined talents: Australian Jack Brabham, making one of his first appearances on the world stage and already showing flashes of the resilience that would one day make him a legend, and Englishman Les Leston, a popular and energetic racer with a background in sports cars and Formula 3. Though few considered Cooper a serious threat to the established giants, their mere presence at Monaco hinted at a future that, perhaps sooner than anyone expected, would rewrite the rules of Grand Prix racing. As for the last British team in Monaco, BRM entered the 1957 season with a mix of determination and trepidation. Unlike their competitors, who had made significant strides with new cars, BRM was still relying on their long-suffering P25 model, a car that had endured a rough start to its life in Formula 1. However, despite these setbacks, BRM remained committed to refining the P25, hoping that the car's mechanical reliability and the talent of their drivers would bring some much-needed results. This season, the team put its trust in Ron Flockhart and Roy Salvadori, two experienced and versatile drivers. Flockhart was known for his smooth driving style, while Salvadori, another seasoned competitor, had already shown his potential in various categories, including sports car racing. In addition to the factory teams, a few private entries also lined up on the narrow streets of Monte Carlo. Among them were two independent drivers, Horace Gould and Luigi Piotti, both piloting Maserati 250Fs, the same model that had proven itself to be one of the most versatile and competitive machines of its era. Though they lacked the latest updates that the Works Maserati team enjoyed, the private 250Fs were still potent enough to pose a challenge in the right hands, especially on a tight and technical circuit like Monaco, where outright power was less critical than precision and rhythm. Joining them was the spirited private outfit, Scuderia Centro Sud, an ambitious Italian team known for giving talented drivers an opportunity on the world stage. For the 1957 Monaco Grand Prix, Centro Sud fielded two cars, one for the experienced French driver André Simon, a seasoned racer familiar with the European circuits, and another for a fresh face from across the Atlantic, American debutante Maston Gregory. Gregory, often nicknamed the Kansas City Flash, was a young man with a fearless reputation and an aggressive driving style that made him an instant attraction. Qualifying at Monaco was never going to be a quiet affair, not when Juan Manuel Fangio and Sterling Moss were sharing a track. Once again, the fight for pole position came down to these two giants, locked in a familiar yet ever-deepening rivalry. But just as the crowd began settling in for the familiar duet, up stormed Peter Collins in his Ferrari, eager to crash the party. Fangio, however, was in no mood for company. With the sort of precision that makes grown engineers weep, he laid down a lap so blistering it made his own 1956 time look like a Sunday drive. Pole position secured, by over a second. Even better, the maestro pulled off this miracle not in Maserati's shiny new V12, which turned out to be all grunt and no grace, but in the older, lighter six-cylinder 250F. Not everyone had such fortune. Young Wolfgang von Trips, making his Monaco debut, found the circuit merciless. The young German was getting out-qualified not only by his teammates, but also by Maserati's Harry Schell and Carlos Menditeguy. A tough pill to swallow, especially when you're in Ferrari red. But the real fireworks came from Maston Gregory. The bespectacled American rookie arrived with no Grand Prix experience, no Monaco experience, and probably no idea what to expect. But there he was, 10th on the grid in a private Maserati. Not bad for your first go in a Formula One car, and not bad at all for a guy who looked more like an accountant than a racing driver. The rest of the grid was settled in a final frantic push. With only 16 spots available, 5 would be left in the shadows. And yes, Brabham made it into the show with a tiny rear-engined Cooper that looked like it had wandered in from a Formula 2 race by mistake. But quick is quick, and Jack was in. The morning of the Grand Prix offers little comfort. Heavy rain lashes down on the Principality, sweeping across the narrow streets and threatening to turn the race into a watery gamble. For a moment, it seems as though Monaco might drown in its own tension. But by noon, the skies clear. The clouds retreat. The circuit, though brushed by chaos just hours before, is dry once more and ready.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to the 1957 Monaco Grand Prix. This is the 15th running of the race here in Monte Carlo, and we are moments away from what promises to be a truly unforgettable afternoon of motor racing. 105 laps lie ahead of our drivers on this notoriously tight and twisting circuit, carved through the streets of the Principality. The earlier rainstorms are now a memory. The skies have cleared, the surface is drying, and conditions are set for an absolutely cracking race. On pole position, the man who needs no introduction, Juan Manuel Fangio of Argentina. The world champion is driving for Maserati this year, and once again showed his brilliance by setting the fastest time, 1 minute 42.7 seconds. Cool, methodical, and utterly unshakable, Fangio begins today's race right where he prefers to be, at the very front. Alongside him on the front row is Britain's own Peter Collins, at the wheel of the red Ferrari. Known for his daring spirit and smooth style, Collins was just 0.6 of a second off Fangio's pace. It's a prime opportunity today for the young Englishman to challenge the world's finest. And lining up third, another Briton, Sterling Moss in the van. Just 9/10 back, Moss is no stranger to Monaco's complexity. With sharp instincts and vast throwing power behind him, expect the number 18 car to be right in the thick of it. So here we are. Engines warm, the grandstands packed, and tension rising across the harbour.
Ahead lies a brutal test. 105 laps, 330 kilometers, or 205 miles, through the tight corners, the shifting light, and the unforgiving barriers of Monte Carlo. The stage is set not for beauty, but for survival.
Monte Carlo has always tested the limits of both man and machine, and today will be no exception. Ladies and gentlemen, the 1957 Monaco Grand Prix is about to begin.
As the flag dropped, Moss and Fangio launched themselves off the line in perfect unison. But Moss was not content to sit and admire the view. Without hesitation, the Englishman unleashed an immediate assault on the reigning world champion. Seizing his moment, Moss slipped past the Argentine, taking command of the race and sending a clear message to the field. Today would not be a quiet afternoon at Monaco. Hardly a lap later, the battle took another twist. Peter Collins, having gathered himself after the frantic start, now locked his sights onto Fangio. With smooth, relentless pressure, he reeled in the Argentine champion. Then, mirroring Moss's earlier boldness, Collins made his move, slicing past Fangio with a clean and confident overtake, drawing gasps from the crowd packed along the narrow streets. On lap 3, disaster strikes for Harry Schell, driving in 4th place. A small mistake, a fleeting moment of hesitation, and just like that, the pack is upon him. What was once a battle for the top positions now slips away, and Schell watches as his hard-earned spot fades into the distance. Fangio, already trailing the leading pair of Moss and Collins, finds himself slipping slightly off the pace. But as he approaches the harbour section, a shocking sight unfolds before him. Two cars, still, facing odd angles. A Van Wall and a Ferrari, Moss and Collins, entangled at the side of the circuit. There is no smoke, no flames, just silence and the eerie aftermath of a sudden, high-speed mistake. Without resistance, without even needing to fight for it, he eases past the stricken machines, reclaiming the position both drivers had fought so hard to take from him just minutes earlier. In Monaco, there's no such thing as an easy pass, but this is as close as you'll ever get. And with that, Fangio slips into the lead. On lap 11, the pressure mounts for Gould as he fights to keep his place in the race. But as he accelerates through the corners, disaster strikes. A slick trail of oil begins to leak from under his car, unnoticed until it's too late. As his tires meet the slick surface, the grip vanishes in an instant. The car slides helplessly, and before Gould can react, the barrier rushes towards him. He slams into the wall, the impact sending a jolt through the crowd. His race is over. On lap 15, Carlos Menditegui, running an impressive fourth in his Maserati, pushed too hard through the chicane and caught the curb with just a bit too much aggression. The result? A damaged tyre that sent him crawling back to the pits. The mechanics got to work with urgency, but even a quick change couldn't prevent the costly drop in position. At the front, Juan Manuel Fangio had already begun weaving his quiet masterpiece. Lap after lap, he steadily pulled away from the chaos behind him, not with drama, but with surgical precision. By this stage of the race, the reigning world champion was already 10 seconds clear of Tony Brooks, who led the chasing pack. On lap 24, Harry Schell limps into the pits with a broken front suspension. His race is over. A bitter end after running solidly in fourth place. Further back, the streets of Monte Carlo witness something truly curious. Jack Brabham, in his nimble little Formula 2 Cooper, now finds himself in the points. The lightweight rear-engine machine, once dismissed as underpowered, is suddenly looking rather clever on these tight city streets. The Australian rookie and the compact Cooper, an unlikely duo, now seem like a perfect match. Jack Brabham, steady as ever in the rear-engined Cooper, now moves up to an astonishing fourth place, and just behind him, Ron Flockhart brings BRM into the points, proof that even the long-suffering P25 can find its footing when Monaco turns chaotic. Carlos Menditegui, determined to recover from his earlier pit stop, begins to charge with unrelenting pace. First, he hunts down Ron Flockhart and dispatches the BRM without hesitation. Then, with the bit between his teeth, he lines up Jack Brabham's nimble Cooper and slips past the Australian in a daring move. In just a handful of corners, Menditegui storms back into fourth place, an impressive recovery drive that reminds everyone just how potent the Argentine can be when he's on form. On lap 41, the Ferrari pit signals Wolfgang von Trips to come in, despite running a confident third. The team has decided to reshuffle the lineup and hand his car over to Mike Hawthorn. The tall Englishman, with his lanky frame, somehow squeezes himself into the snug cockpit of the German's Ferrari. Nevertheless, Hawthorn rejoins the circuit still in third place, but it's immediately clear that something's not quite right. After just 3 laps, he's wrestling the car rather than driving it, awkward, cramped, and clearly uncomfortable. Accepting the futility of it all, Hawthorn dives back into the pits, giving von Trips a hurried nod as he clambers out. The German doesn't need to be told twice. He leaps back into his machine, straps in, and roars out of the pit lane with renewed purpose. Halfway through the race, Carlos Menditeguy's spirited charge comes to a sudden, brutal end. Pushing hard to close the gap to the leaders, the Argentine misjudges his line through the chicane, a treacherous section that had already claimed victims earlier in the afternoon. The Maserati twitches under braking, and in a split second, the rear steps out. Menditaguy tries to catch the slide, but there's no room for error in Monaco. On lap 60, disaster strikes Ron Flockhart and the struggling BRM team. Without warning, thick smoke begins to pour from the tail of the P25. Spectators lining the harbour see the ominous grey cloud long before the car rounds the corner, limping along the circuit. Flockhart, already in a points-paying position, knows there's no saving it. BRM's hopes evaporate in a puff of smoke, reliability proving to be the team's Achilles heel. On lap 62, Jack Brabham brings his little Cooper T43 into the pits for a scheduled refueling stop, a necessity for the smaller Formula 2 machine that had been punching far above its weight all afternoon. During the halt, both Maston Gregory and Harry Schell slip ahead, pushing Brabham down the order. Just a lap later, disaster strikes for Harry Schell as his car succumbs to an oil leak, forcing the American to retire from the race yet again. This unexpected turn of events means that Brabham, who had just been overtaken during his pit stop, is back up to 5th place once more. Jack Brabham wasn't finished yet. In the very next sequence, he closed in on Maston Gregory. Then, without hesitation, Brabham eased past the American with a clean and calculated move, his Formula 2 machine darting ahead once more. The Australian was back in 4th place, rewriting expectations with every lap he completed. Wolfgang von Trips was holding steady in 3rd, calm, consistent, seemingly on course for a podium. But then, without warning, a plume of white smoke erupted from the rear of his Ferrari. The engine gave out in dramatic fashion, an explosion of noise and vapor, silencing the hopes of Scuderia Ferrari. Lap 100, and just as Jack Brabham's fairy tale drive seemed destined for a glorious ending, disaster struck. Approaching the casino, his little Cooper began to sputter, then silence. The car rolled to a quiet stop, out of fuel. It was a heartbreaking end for the Australian and his rear-engined Formula 2 machine, but a small miscalculation on fuel, in a race where every drop counted, had undone one of the most impressive performances of the day. The checkered flag falls in Monaco, and once again, it's Juan Manuel Fangio who claims it. Unshaken, efficient, and as commanding as ever, he brings the Maserati home in 1st place. Another Grand Prix, another clinic in control. It's his 2nd win of the season, and the reigning champion strengthens his grip on the title with all the inevitability of gravity. Some 25 seconds later, the crowd erupts again, this time for Tony Brooks. The young Briton, calm and composed in the van wall, crosses the line to secure 2nd place. For Tony van der Velde's Green Challengers, this is more than just a result. It's history, Van Wall's first podium in Formula 1, and proof that British engineering has truly arrived. Then, against all expectation, comes the day's revelation. In 3rd, it's Maston Gregory. The American rookie, driving for the privateer Scuderia Centro Sud, has stayed out of trouble while chaos unfolded ahead. On his Grand Prix debut, he finishes on the podium. Not by luck, but by clarity, consistency, and quiet brilliance. Just behind him in 4th, another debutant makes his mark, Stuart Lewis Evans. At the wheel of his Connaught, the young Brit delivers a smooth and resilient drive, defying the odds in an underfunded car that now has every reason to be proud. 5th goes to Maurice Trintignant, who, after losing 5 laps to engine gremlins, fights back with relentless determination to salvage 2 precious points. And with the checkered flag down in Monaco, the championship picture begins to take shape. At the top, no surprises. Argentina's Juan Manuel Fangio leads the table with 17 points, having already stamped his authority on the season with 2 commanding victories. In 2nd, it's Jean Bera of France with 6 points, still hanging on, but in need of something special to keep pace with the master. And joining him on equal footing, Britain's Tony Brooks. After a remarkable drive in Monaco, the young Van Wall pilot now finds himself tied for second in the standings, carrying the hopes of British motorsport into the next round. Pack your berets and brace yourselves. Formula One is heading back to France. The legendary Rouen-les-Essarts circuit is back, with fast straights, tricky hairpins, and enough elevation changes to make a driver dizzy. Modern pits? Check. Massive grandstands? You bet. Screaming engines echoing through the Normandy hills? Oh yes, please. The 1957 French Grand Prix is coming up. See you at Rouen.